gender, right? So sex and gender is all about how people understand and think about themselves, right? Sex and sexuality is about the verb form of sex, right? The relationships we have with other people. And so those are two distinct processes, hence two distinct chapters in the book. So a person's sexuality, or the concept of sexualities in general, is that they are social behaviors and categories that are related to our sexual desires. Sexuality, has this really interesting place in our culture because it's kind of paradoxical, right? On the one hand, we have all this, private, treated as secret, don't talk about, it's for the bedroom, right? Sexual behavior. But then on the other hand, you turn on the media or any popular culture, right? And there's this, talk of sex or depictions in the media or advertising, right? But one thing we do know about sexuality in relation to this is that there is a distinction in our culture and in many cultures between sexuality and romantic attraction, right? So sex is the, physical act of intercourse, right? But romantic attraction is a different kind of category that can include sexual behavior. So romantic attraction refers to feelings of love, affection, and longing for someone. And that is a distinct category. There can be sexual behavior without romantic attraction. As I'm sure we're aware, there can also be romantic attraction without sexual behavior. So this is mostly definitional and probably not surprising. These terms are probably not, completely new to you. But are there any questions about that? I'll give you a minute to write it all down, though. So as a culture, we have this, kind of interesting paradox where we think of sex as this private thing on the one hand, but then it has this very public, discussions about it as well. And part of that is because of our interesting history as a culture, with like puritanical roots and very heavy religious kind of overtones, but then also, advertising and things like that, kind of bringing it out of us. And really it has evolved into two opposing perspectives on how sexuality should be treated as a concept in our culture. Right? There's what is called the sex-negative view that sees sex and sexual behavior as fundamentally dangerous, right? As risky, as private, something that shouldn't be talked about, something that's a problem to be managed or repressed or controlled. And you can thank, again, our history for a lot of that approach to sexual behavior. And of course, in the last several generations, arguably since the 60s, we've seen a push to be, as a culture, a bit more sex positive. The sex positive view is one that understands that consensual sexual relationships are a fundamentally positive activity. Not a dangerous or negative activity, but a positive one. One that can be seen as a healthy expression of, of feelings or of urges or whatever, right? Does that make sense? And, at different times in our history and even with different audiences, right? Oftentimes with teenagers, we take a very sex-negative view, right? Explaining all the STDs and unplanned pregnancy and all the risks associated with sexual behavior as though we can stop them from being teenagers, right? Whereas, adults are often, talk amongst themselves in a more sex-positive view, although not always. And it can, go back and forth. But questions about these? I don't think the terms are that tricky, but you never know. So basically, is it a fundamentally negative view of sexual behavior or a fundamentally positive one? And obviously, the sex-positive view is dealing specifically with consensual sexual acts. So that brings me to the idea of sexual orientation. because that is also a term that we use in tandem with sexuality, right? Sexuality is just your sexual being, and the behaviors you engage in, but sexual orientation is how our society classifies somebody based on their sexual interests and behaviors and things like that, right? So officially, sexual orientation is defined as how your sexual desires are patterned in relationship to the gender system. How sexual desires are patterned in relationship to the gender system. I'll leave this up for a minute, but last week we talked about the gender system, right? That we have a very binary view of gender, that there are men and there are women, and it's hard for a lot of people in our culture to kind of think about others, right, besides those sort of two boxes. And so our traditional way of describing a person's sexual orientation is with respect to that binary view, right? So you've probably heard terms like heterosexual or homosexual, right, as different sexual orientations. Kind of, again, implying that it's one or the other, right? So really a person's sexual orientation is a combination of three components. The first is who a person has sexual desires or arousal towards. We call that their sexual attraction, right? So that's a component of your orientation, is who you are attracted to sexually. Who turns you on, so to speak, right? What kinds of people or persons. The second component of sexual orientation is not just about who you're attracted to. We also include information or measures about who a person actually engages in sexual acts with. In other words, their sexual behavior. And as you might imagine, there are people who profess a certain type of attraction, but whose behavior may not match with what they report as their attraction. And that's why the person and how the person thinks about themselves is equally as weighted in this formula of sexual orientation, because the third component is a person's sexual identity, how a person thinks about or describes themselves to others. Sometimes you hear in the media or in pop culture or whatever, people say like, oh, I identify as heterosexual or whatever, right? That's a person invoking their sexual identity, how they describe themselves. And so a person's true sexual orientation is really a combination of who they're attracted to, who they engage in sexual behaviors with, and how they think about themselves. And that's why, a person who largely is attracted to women and has sexual relationships with women, but has one relationship with a man, right, or someone who's not a woman, doesn't necessarily change that person's entire orientation, right? They experimented, they tried something, but it wasn't necessarily who they're normally attracted to, who they engage with, or what their identity is, right? Does that make sense? All right. So I mentioned the terms heterosexual and homosexual. Those are certainly two types of sexual orientation. So in our culture, the dominant category, meaning the category that is both statistically and culturally the most common, is heterosexuality, which refers to the term hetero there means different, right? And it refers to someone who's sexually attracted / behaviors / identity to a person of a different gender. Again, this sort of implies a gender binary here, right? That if you are male and attracted to females, that's a different gender, you're heterosexual, right? Or if you're a female attracted to males. But there are many other types of sexual orientation, of course, besides heterosexual. These other categories, because heterosexuality is the dominant category in our culture, these other categories are, technically speaking, minority groups, right? They're sexual minorities, not the dominant category. So, of course, there is homosexuality, which is often referred to as gay or lesbian, depending on the person's gender, although, of course, that implies that there are just two genders, and if you're attracted to a member of the same gender, you are either gay or lesbian. There are other terms I'm going to get to in a minute, but another term you may have heard or hear is bisexual. Those are people who are attracted to both or multiple genders. Perhaps, I'm not going to, by the way, test you on all the intricacies of all these, but there's also pansexual. Those are individuals who report attraction to people regardless of their gender. Right? They don't find themselves attracted specifically to men or specifically to women, but actually to just individuals where their gender is notwithstanding. And asexual are people who report low or lack of sexual attraction to anyone. So these are terms you may have heard used before, but these would be primarily non-dominant categories, right? Heterosexuality is sort of the quote-unquote assumption of our culture. Do those make sense? Questions about those? Like, again, I'm not gonna test you on the intricacies of all of them, but there are even more categories that do not fit those simple. Even those are simple categories, right? Of kinds of either or assumptions about gender, right? So maybe you've heard the term queer before, right? The term queer indicates someone with a non-normative sexuality, or a non-normative gender, or a non-normative sex. And really what the point of the word queer is to blur the line between the categories of sex and sexuality and gender. That the categories that we set up as a culture assume a gender binary, assume a black and white kind of view of man-woman relations, right? Male-female, or male-male, or female-female relations. The idea of invoking the concept of queer is to say, no, it's like, it's a spectrum, right? It's not just this and the relations between them. It's all types of people and the relationships with all types of people, right? And so I know that different groups use the word queer to specifically mean different things, but I don't think there's an agreement across the board. Yeah, right. And so, in general, I don't believe it's used, well, it can be used as a slur, but it isn't meant to be a slur when used among the community in frank discussions, right? It certainly was an example of reclaiming of a term that was, once a slur, but. And then, of course, you may see things like LGBTQ or LGBTQIA or 2As or plus, right? The idea of this, right, is to try to show that there are a lot of different kinds of sexuality out there, and actually gender identity as well. So the letters, stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer. There's questioning, or A is sometimes used for allies, or other asexual, all sorts of letters. The point of this sort of acronym or alphabet soup is the idea of reflecting the interconnected experiences that people of either sexual minority or gender minorities feel. Right? Because sex and gender do go very closely together, oftentimes the experiences that gender minorities feel is very similar to the kinds of experiences of sexual minorities as well. There are more, though, just two more that I want to mention. So another one you may hear sometimes is poly, or polyamory, or polygamy. Polygamy we know as a person with multiple spouses. Polyamory is a person with multiple lovers, right? It doesn't have the legal side of marriage, but mostly it's a Western term, like in the U.S. and Europe. A term for consensually non-monogamous relationships. Open marriages or open relationships often use that term.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Is that where the palamoni came from? The word palamoni?
The word, I'm so sorry, the word poly what?
Is the palamoni. If they lived together for a number of years.
Palimony.
The stars was up in the hands because of the palimony's suits. Is that what does it mean if you live with somebody for some time?
I do not believe so. I hear you now, Mimi. I do not believe so. It is not the same.
Okay.
A good question, but it has a different root word, so it's not the same. Yes.
And what is described by asex? What does it mean?
Oh, asexual are people who do not feel like they have any sexual drive at all, or very, very little. So, you know how like, what's another word that uses a, that means no? Amoral. Somebody who is amoral has no morals. Somebody who is asexual has no sexual drive.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I did not understand. I heard the word, but I could not put together.
Understood.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, of course. Oh, wait till we get to the next one. How about kinky? That's the last one I have here. I bet you've heard this word before somewhere. So kinky refers to, it can be an orientation. Some people think it should be describing like a whole sexual orientation around things like bondage and discipline and submission, and maybe you've heard BDSM before, right? Those kinds of sexual behaviors, some people believe is like an orientation. Others think of it as just certain types of sexual behavior that you might choose to engage in. I don't have an answer for that, but that is what is meant by kinky, right? So it could be an orientation itself, or it could just be a category of sexual behavior. Either one would be fine. How many of you thought you'd learned about kinky in the college classroom today? Anyway, so orientation is all the different ways that we are attracted to, the behavior we engage in, and how we think about our sexual behavior as a human or a person. Does that make sense? So, I mentioned that heterosexuality is the dominant group. It is the most common that people report. It is the most common that people report behavior of, and it is the most common way that people report attraction. That being said, the number of people who in the U.S. who identify as non-heterosexual, right? In 2016, the measure they asked was, do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans? They didn't include words like queer or kinky in that one, but either way, as you can see through the 20-teens, right, the rate of people who self-identify on a survey, right, as LGBT, it was steadily increasing. Measuring this is really hard, right? Measuring people's sexuality and their sexual behavior is really hard. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why on the next slide, or the slide after that, because I have another graph. But one thing that we are sure about is trends, right? So we may not be sure if we're capturing the exact right percentage of people at any given moment, but we do see that the number is either growing or shrinking in various cases. So we see growth in that area. This is the percent of LGBT adults by state. This is from 2012. I could not find a decent graph version of this, or not graph, chart, picture, map, that's the word I want, map version of this data for anything more recent than 2012. But as you can see, it's widely various about the states, around the states. There's not necessarily a trend in terms of like, all of New England has, a large concentration. It's kind of spread out. We do see Hawaii and Washington, D.C. as having the highest percentage of folks who identify. But, so like if we ask people in an online survey to self-identify, right, you get higher percentages than other methods, right? Because there's more anonymity online, I think, and people are a little bit more willing to admit, to things that they might not admit to in person. And the census, importantly, the census does not ask about sexual orientation. That's not a question on the census. for a variety of reasons that I could get into if you want to send me an email. But yeah, it's just long, complicated census stuff. But so we can't use the census as like every 10 years we can get a real clear snapshot. So we have to rely on some other data. So this comes from the Pew Research Center, which is a fairly well-known, well-respected national polling, not affiliated with politics or whatever kind of entity. Another one that Pew released was, this is by state, DC of course is listed there by numbers. So the highest percentage, this was 2015, 2016, so it's a little more recent than this one, where you can see about 8.6 of the people of the adults in the District of Columbia, 8.6%, identify as LGBT. And here we have, Hawaii doesn't even show up on this list, so I'm not sure why that is, but Vermont, this might be 48, maybe. No, because DC's there, so I don't know. Anyway, Vermont, Oregon, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Maine down here is actually number 10 in the percentage of folks in that state who identify. So there's this kind of like a snapshot in time, like, okay, so we're looking at anywhere between like 3 to 8% of people in the given area, right, kind of self-identify as LGBT. But there's a lot of demographic differences over who those people are. Among those who identify as LGBT, we have a big difference. So here's men and women. So men and women, about 3.7% of men and 4.4% of women identify as LGBT. This is 2016 data again. That's not a huge difference among the two. But when you look at racial categories, for example, we see that whites are the smallest category, that non-white racial groups have higher rates of identifying as LGBT. And pretty significantly, when it comes to age group, right, young people are much more likely to identify as LGBT than people in the 37 to 51 category, or this 52 to 70, or the 71 plus category. And the last one is their average household income, or annual household income, right? People who make under 36,000. So in other words, poor people are more likely to identify as opposed to middle income or upper income groups. The class differences here, they might be related to age, right? So the more people, right, young people just don't earn as much as people who've been in careers, right, for their lives. So I'm not sure that the income is actually driving much of this. It might be more about the age group that's driving both income and rates of identification. And there are virtually no differences across education level, interestingly. So no difference among people without high school diploma, people with high school diploma, people with college education, or advanced degrees. So I mentioned, though, all of this data is kind of based on imperfect measurement, right? Because this is a difficult thing to measure. And so, there we go. Survey researchers face a number of challenges in measuring LGBTQ identities. Social scientists across the board have not developed a consensus about the best way to measure sexual orientation. Lots of social scientists measure it differently. For example, if you've ever heard of the Gallup poll or the Pew Research Center that I just mentioned, they measure sexual orientation by self-identification. They just say, hey, tell us what your orientation is, right? And if people say they're LGBTQ, then they count it as that. But there are other ways to measure orientation. We know that that self-identification is just one of the ways, right? There was also attraction and behaviors. And so other measures of sexual orientation, they don't ask people, do you identify as, gay, straight, or whatever? They say, they ask people to report on their most recent or most common sexual behaviors or attractions, right? The two parts of orientation that are not self-identification. And it turns out when you ask people to self-identify, you get one measure, but when you ask people to explain their attractions or their behaviors, you get a much higher estimate. Again, because people, it's the labeling part that kind of stops people, right? Now that could be because they don't understand labels, it could be because of the stigma associated with labels. There's a lot of reasons why they might not want to label it. But when you ask them about, behavior and attraction, people tend to be more forthcoming. And I just said this, right? So stigma, it could be perhaps because of the stigma of identifying as LGBTQ in some cultures or subcultures. So people don't want to self-report that way, but if you ask them, have you ever had a sexual encounter with someone of the same sex, they might say yes, right? Even though they don't identify as homosexual, for example. And the other thing I also already mentioned was a lot of times respondents are simply unfamiliar with the terms, both because terms have evolved and changed over time, or because terms didn't exist when they were forming their sexual identities, or because the terms mean different things to different people, like the word queer, for example, or it can mean different things to different people. So a lot of social research on sexual orientation tries to deal with defining terms clearly and saying, okay, based on these definitions, which one do you, it's not easy, right? So, can you think of other, issues?
Well,
or whatever you want to say.
Being unfamiliar with terms, having gone to school in Texas and North Carolina, you don't get to discuss those terms in school. If somebody catches you or you say something like that, you can get it very easily.
Absolutely, not only...
Depending on school district.
Right.
So, and it's not just I know some states have law, but also just some school districts have policy where, it's sexual behavior in general is, talk about it. And it's not necessarily anti-LGBT, it's all sexual behavior.
It's sex negative, that's all, yeah. It's just...
You don't talk about sex, period.
Right.
So it's not just, you talked about, a gay relationship or whatever.
Right.
You don't talk about it at all. It just,
Right. So having a sex-negative cultural background or viewpoint, right, is going to lead you either intentionally or unintentionally to probably not be familiar with terminology or behaviors in general, but also maybe you were never allowed to be exposed to them, depending on your background. Absolutely. Or those who were raised in particular religious traditions might have only learned certain kinds of sex, if they even learned about sex. And just not know. You get to college or you get somewhere out in the world and suddenly there's a whole new world that opens up to you, right? With terms like kinky, and you might not know, right? So, yeah. Right, in addition to just us being embarrassed about it, not wanting to talk about sex in general, to the potential stigma of, admitting to a non-normative sexual orientation, to simply being ignorant or unaware or unfamiliar with terms, you can see how all these measures are tricky, right? So even though we're getting estimates of 4 to 5%, you can safely assume that those numbers are in reality a little bit higher, right? Just it's hard to capture. Oh, sorry. Okay, so any questions about what sexuality is or what sexual orientation is? Those are the bigger things than I don't need you to know the exact difference between polyamory and asexuality or whatever, but the idea of sexual orientation and the 3 things that make it up, attraction, behavior, and identity, those are important. And maybe a general understanding of why our statistics might not be perfectly accurate. All right, so this course is about social problems, right? Not just about sexual behavior or whatever, or how we measure it. And so throughout history, non-normative sexual orientation or orientations have been treated negatively, right? Societies have viewed non-normative sexual orientations and behaviors as dangers to morality or as mental illness. And that's just throughout history, but it's not ancient history, it's recent history. Sometimes there's been discussions of the sins that people who engage in premarital or extramarital sexual behavior are exposed to, right? So it's not just about homosexuality. Premarital and extramarital sex are also non-normative sexual behaviors, right? We expect, our norm is that you will, I guess our cultural norm is kind of, you get married, you have sexual relations for procreative purposes only, and that's it, right? So, this kind of behavior would be non-normative. Sex work, which we'll talk about in the second half today, but prostitution, pornography, all that kind of stuff, right, is seen as, a decaying morality, right, things like that. And so for hundreds of years, and as recently as 1976, certain kinds of sexual orientation, like homosexuality, were considered mental illness. And so because of the negative connotations of non-normative sex, when you combine that with a culture that's just unwilling to talk about sex in general, right, sex negative view, we have this repression of public discussions of sex and sexuality, and it has led to negative social side effects. For example, fears about people who are sexual minorities have led to discrimination, harassment, and violence directed at those who are, or even just are perceived to be, non-heterosexual. A generic term for this is something like gay bashing, right? Where, which despite its name can be applied to anyone who's non-heterosexual, facing violence or harassment or things like that. Not to mention the discrimination that many feel is either sanctioned or at least not punishable by law. And so the discrimination is legal in many cases, and that, of course, has led to other issues as well. I have more on the next slide, but I'll let you guys get this down. Any questions about, and again, this isn't just at LGBTQ individuals, but also at, the idea that our society kind of lashes out at anything that isn't sort of the traditional, repressed kind of idea of sex, right? So we care about this so much so that to the extent that we have created actual laws, societies try to enforce norms around sex and sexuality through punitive laws governing sexual expression and behavior. Yes?
Growing up, personally, back in the 50s, if a child showed any symptoms of being gay, they would give them shock therapy. Because supposedly was in his mind, and that would clear up.
So, right.
It was like so bizarre, and thank goodness we have come a long ways, because all humans deserve to love and be loved. Doesn't matter their sexuality, But used to happen in Europe and Brazil, South America, all over. Was a lot of people. You remember Rock Hudson. It was so hidden, liberal. Everybody proclaimed that they had a right, but nobody would see them.
Right.
Because of the fear. They would lose their jobs back then.
Right.
And it's really amazing how the acceptance have changed.
A couple things you mentioned, Mimi. You made me, at the end, you made me think of the idea of a confirmed bachelor. Have you ever heard that phrase where a lot of men, and then they went as a confirmed bachelor, which was a code word, right?
Religious sector.
Yes.
Confirmed bachelor. He has met so many girls.
Right.
But, he cannot choose.
That must be what it is, yeah.
On the long run, the parents know what it is.
Right. And it's
like, because people of my age, I'm a very open-minded person,
Yeah.
And those things don't come my way.
Yeah.
A person to person, a human being. But that's what it is, a confirmed bachelor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And as you said too, one of the reasons people would be motivated to do something like that, to claim to be something else, to hide the truth, is because they were facing things like electroshock therapy or other kinds of, forced treatment.
Yeah. Even being beat up by friends.
Chemical castration, right? Yeah.
Even back not long ago, okay? A man was a guy on TV that they asked him to come to this talk show, and that the guy declared his love for him. He left the show, went home, got a gun, and killed the gay guy.
Oh, yeah.
Wasn't many years ago. If you look for the crime on TV, they are featured there now. Another thing was that in many sectors, you did not have sex exchange. The first time that I heard sex exchange was a distant cousin that was a girl that was extremely masculine. Yeah. And, nobody would say anything, but was that question mark in the minds.
Right.
And one summer, she disappeared, and she came back dressed in white suit, short hair, good-looking person. She had a sex exchange. She was double sex.
Yeah,
and okay. So, yes, so she did the surgery because she could no longer live like that.
Right.
So when I say we have come a long ways, today you would have the therapy to change it, the sexuality, this and that, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's not illegal. And especially for Brazil, that back then was considered a third world country, I think that was a huge step.
I agree, and I think, your point is well taken that not only have the rates of people being able to identify as non-normative sexualities increased, but part of that is because there has been more acceptance over time, right? And more understanding of sexual behavior and the range of behaviors, and not quite as many punitive punishments, though they still exist in some places, at times, and forms, and whatever. I agree. I think it is getting better. And actually, our activity today is going to deal with changing attitudes over time about, in this case, about same-sex marriage, but similar idea, right? So, yes.
We're supposed to be a pious society.
Oh, cheer?
Pious. Yes, you know what I mean? And so, religion has to get in there. And I am a churchgoer. But, at times you see that, what's this piety? What's going on behind the curtain?
Right. Well, let's try to pull back some more then, the curtain.
Yes. Let's open it.
So though things are better now, there are, actual laws that either were on the books, or some of which may continue to be on the books, or lack of protective laws on the books. So one example historically is sodomy laws. So basically, sodomy laws are laws that outlaw sexual behavior that is oral or anal sex. I don't know another way to put it. Oral or anal sex. That behavior becomes outlawed under places that have sodomy laws. I did write it nicely in my lecture. It defines consensual, non-normative sex acts as crimes. And so, for generations, social leaders and culture would advocate for stigmatizing and punishing people who were outside of cultural norms. And this is one way we did that, by writing laws that said, if you engage in a non-normative sex act, meaning, oral or anal sex, that is a crime, and it is punishable by things including fines and short-term, but still imprisonment. Sodomy laws were on the books in the United States through the 1950s and 60s, when individual states started removing those sodomy laws from the books. And then eventually the Supreme Court of the United States struck down all the remaining ones that were in place in the U.S. in 2003. And so that, was an example. That was Lawrence v. Kansas was the Supreme Court decision that resulted in that, where the government does not have standing to regulate sexual behavior between consenting adults. That being said, though, they do not continually exist in the U.S. They do exist, Saudi laws, in as many as 72 countries worldwide.
Who is the government to enter my bedroom? Who is the government to enter my bedroom?
I agree. I don't see, as long as everybody involved can make an informed decision themselves.
Usually, the sex is in between two adults.
Yeah.
And that the word adult means you're grown up. You can say yes or you can say no. And nobody, that irritates me because the government wants to get into my bedroom, which they have no business in anybody's bedroom.
I agree, but you'll be happy, Mimi, to know that Brazil is one of the places around the world that does recognize same-sex marriage. There are places around the world that recognize partnerships, if not marriages. Those are the blue and the green. The purple are countries that not only criminalize sexual orientation, non-heterosexual. The purple countries are countries where there's a death penalty. And the orange.
Not yet. Brazil, I think, is the only country that you live together for a year. You are married by law. And if you separate, everything that is there is both, even if just one building. I think that's the only country. For somebody who's considered a third world country, I think we're very advanced in some things.
Absolutely, I agree, especially socially. And the orange countries are places where people face imprisonment for non-normative sexual behavior. Yellow is where it is criminalized, but there's no penalty. Like there's not necessarily a punishment for it. You're just not supposed to do it. So as you can see, a lot of the Western Hemisphere and Europe is mostly recognizing of relationships as opposed to banning them. But not exclusively.
Challenge that the no penalizing law. For most of those countries, the penalty is, I'd say, a good portion of Africa is probably still death. You just felt it's not openly.
It's just not written into law.
Penalizing law just means it's not on the books.
It's not on the books. That is 100% fair.
Yeah, in China, same thing.
I was going to say China.
There's likely some punishment. I don't know. I would say death, but there could be re-education camps.
Yeah.
It would be likelihood.
Agreed. Forced conversion, right?
That's the word I was looking for. I was looking for that word earlier, conversion camps. I did not think of it.
Yes. Re-education is another format. So
that'd be my guess.
I think that's a fair challenge, that the ones that say there's no penalizing law, that's all it means is that there's nothing on the books that says, if you engage in this behavior, here's your punishment. It's going to happen other ways. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Though there are still 8 nations that do enforce the death penalty on the books. So, yeah. Right. Questions or comments about the law when it comes to non-normative sexual behavior? There's more, but at least about sexual orientation. So we also have laws and rules around sex work. Sex work officially is defined as business that provides sex-related products and services. Of course, prostitution is the most common type of sex work that we're familiar with, where literally you're providing a sex-related service, sexual behavior for money. But other types of sex work can include things like pornography, escort services, things that I'm probably not, I don't even know about, right? Almost all countries around the world have laws either regulating or criminalizing sex work, and in particular, prostitution. The largest group of countries, which includes the U.S., consider any form of prostitution to be illegal. Now, there are a few municipal statutes in, like, the state of Nevada, and I believe, except for the city limits of Las Vegas, and I believe Rhode Island, until recently, had maybe it was Providence, something in Rhode Island. I don't know the details on that one. Again, not a legal scholar, but anyway, most places criminalize, right, sex work, though there are also legal policies in places where the transaction of sex for money is legal, but everything that kind of goes along with it, like money laundering or certainly trafficking and all the other stuff like that is all still illegal. And so that's how they kind of try to get at it. The point is, by having these legal policies of any kind around sex work, it reflects our widespread concerns as a culture about the consequences of sex work, whether those consequences are moral consequences or legal consequences, physical consequences, social consequences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that we see fit to regulate / criminalize sex work reflects our interest that it might be somehow dangerous or problematic, whether or not it is. You guys write that down, and then I have examples of specific stuff on the next slide. But. So, kind of like when we talk about sexual behavior, I was trying to qualify by saying, between consenting adults, right? Because obviously, anytime there is the lack of consent or non-adults involved in a sexual relationship, we have a vested interest in not only preventing that or stopping that kind of behavior, but punishing it. When it comes to sex work, we also have this line between there's plenty of completely fine sex work that occurs, but there's also a lot of problematic, dangerous, exploitative sex work that occurs. And we have to write laws that cover both kinds, right? And so it's hard to just automatically ban everything or automatically allow everything. So basically, when it comes to sex work, there are two camps, right? One that says we should ban everything, and one that says we should allow everything. So the arguments for people who are in favor of prohibiting prostitution, in other words, banning prostitution, right? Some feminist groups view prostitution as an avenue through which men exploit women. That absolutely occurs in the field of prostitution, that men can exploit women. And so one argument for banning prostitution is, if we ban prostitution, if we prohibit prostitution, we can limit or significantly decline the number of men exploiting women, at least in this one type of behavior. Maybe, I don't know. Another argument for prohibition is that prostitution incentivizes human trafficking of women and children. There is some evidence that countries that have legalized prostitution have had elevated levels of human trafficking inflows. That they're seeing greater numbers of people being human trafficked into that country where prostitution is legal. It's early, and it's not like totally confirming evidence, but there is some that supports this. There is also research that suggests that legalizing prostitution does not significantly improve the lives of most prostitutes. In other words, people who go into sex work are often poor, right, or racial or ethnic minorities, and the problems they face as being poor or a minority are not alleviated by having their profession also being made illegal. Are not alleviated by their profession being made legal. And other people argue, in fact, that legalizing prostitution actually increases demand for it, thus increasing the number of people who are exploited by it. I don't know, as a person, just me, Lorian, speaking here, I don't know where I fall on the prohibition and regulation side. I certainly don't think prohibition outright of anything ever works. Ever. But I do think, that there is some evidence to support, the existence of prostitution as it is currently, as it operates, has very negative consequences for people involved, even if it's by choice. And of course, for those where it's not by choice, that's obviously already a problem. So, on the other side of the coin then here are arguments for people who want to legalize prostitution, right? Or at least regulate it. And the argument is that prostitution can be a consensual sexual act between adults. It kind of goes back to Mimi's point about why is the government in my bedroom? If I, as being a sound-minded body, want to pay someone money to engage in a behavior with me, to provide me a service, when that person is completely consensually agreeing to it, then who cares? Right? Why should that be regulated by anyone? Another argument is that if we try to prohibit prostitution, criminalize it, making it illegal makes exploitation more likely because the industry has to go underground. Right? It's like the argument for or against legalizing marijuana. Right? Oh, well, the black market is going to make it so much worse or better or whatever. Same goes for prostitution. And the third one is actually, this is my favorite argument because it's so boring, which is that if we legalize prostitution, we can regulate and tax it, right? And regulations and taxes are actually a good thing for society, insofar as unregulated sex work denies prostitutes worker rights. They could unionize if we made it legal, guys. Right? But for real, there's no OSHA for prostitution because prostitution is illegal here. If it was legal, they could be protected and have worker safety. They could be tested for STDs on a regular basis. They could be paid living wages, right? All of these things, that sounds super boring, right? Could be applied to sex work. Yeah.
I just want to put a counter to that.
Yeah.
Imagine the Amazon of sex work. That's not exactly going to be the case.
Oh, right. So even if it's legal, it's still capitalist. Is the problem, right? Yeah. Neo-capitalist, but yes. Fair enough that without regulation, there's a problem too, right? And that's why I personally I don't think I'm all the way one way or all the way the other, right? I don't think it should be unfettered and unregulated, but I also don't think criminalizing it is helping anybody. Yeah. Can you imagine saving for retirement in that field? I mean, you could have a retirement account, you could have health insurance, you could have all these things, right? And despite our decisions as a nation, about 30 countries around the world have fully decriminalized sex work. Almost half of them are in Central and South America. Everybody thinks of like the Netherlands, right, when they hear like legalized, regulated sex work, but most of them are in Central and South America with some level of regulation. And then in the last 2 decades, starting with Sweden in 1999, Europe and the Americas have moved to a legal model where paying for sex is illegal, but being a prostitute is not. In other words, the onus falls on the John.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right.
I thought the way you worded it first I made it.
Right, but so paying for sex is illegal, but being a prostitute is not illegal. So therefore, only the clients who are seeking the prostitution can be charged with the crime. It's an interesting approach. I'm not saying it's the right one or the wrong one, but
there are countries in Europe that pay, the government pays for your prostitutes.
True. Formally or informally? Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's considered part of their disability program.
Yeah. Huh.
So, the whole, the government's going to make it
You can't pay for it.
not legal here, well, that's going to pay for it.
Well, to be fair, that sounds like most government policy. We say it's this way, but we do it this way. Yeah. But interesting point. I didn't know that. So yeah, that's very possible. But anyway, there's got to be some system, right? That's somewhere between the Wild Wild West and total, total lockdown of that kind of behavior, right? So I don't know what it is, but.
That's the other thing I wanted to mention,
Yeah.
that covered earlier on Nevada, is the fact that, well, yes, it's legal outside of Vegas, U.S. government owns like about 80%, and it's not legal there.
Federal.
On federal grounds.
Yeah.
And the rest is desert, where nobody lives.
You just have to go to Reno, that's about it.
So there's like Reno, and like that's it. Like, I mean, there's really not anywhere to go in Vegas to commit across, the evil. There is.
You can find it, but yes.
You can't go the whole city. It's not the whole city.
The whole
You stand on the sidewalk handing out flyers.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. What I mean to say is, it's not like, oh, I just crossed the border up here, Idaho. I just go. No, there's nothing out there. So you're kind of stuck down in that one little portion of your Vegas, but not in Vegas.
Right.
The legal loophole is that the business transaction cannot take place in Las Vegas.
Right, so they can go to the city limits.
Yeah.
You can literally leave Las Vegas, pay, and then come back to Las Vegas and complete your deal.
Yeah.
I was just getting to that point though. Like, I know that that's.
It sounds like, oh, it's illegal in the whole state.
But
Yeah.
there's not really. Literally, there's only like one little tiny portion where people actually frequent that is legal. The rest is like desert.
Desert or, proving grounds. Kind of like when one of the first states legalized marijuana, right? And federally it's still illegal, and even though the state did, you couldn't, so much of the state is not federal land. Anyway, yes. I hear ya.
And then also banking and stuff like that still for prostitution, I would assume is probably still very regulated.
Right.
Just like with marijuana. A lot of people that sell marijuana cannot go to banks because the banks don't want to have that money because it's technically laundering, I think.
Right, something like that. Yeah, it's not insurable, and it's not FDIC. Yeah.
Give banking services if it's.
Right. So.
I would imagine that's going to be the same issue when states.
Oh, it's always the boring stuff that bogs it down, right? It's the banking law. It's the union, organization.
That's the same issue that came up with why OnlyFans was trying to get rid of it, was because of banking law.
Right, they weren't allowed
Banks
to.
were going to shut off their transferring funds system, and they didn't have anybody at the time to transfer funds. So they're like, yeah, we're just going to get rid of it because we can't pay you.
Right.
We can't pay you.
They're calling this prostitution, or they're calling this sex work. So yeah.
The thing that built your website, you're going to get rid of.
You're gonna get rid of it.
Well,
they realized.
People that were doing it, so it's kind of like, well, what are we going to do? And then they got an alternate pay system, so they were like, okay, we're here now.
Yeah.
It's the hypocrisy that
Right.
the paying for sex is illegal, but a camera in the mix,
Right. Now it's a different industry. Yeah.
Or not, depending on the bank.
And I mean, this is legitimately, it brings the point up that, why do you think we always default to the way we've been doing it? Because it's so much easier to just do things the same way rather than try to address these blatant hypocrisies or these clear regulatory problems, right? It's easier to just pretend we're not going to do anything about it and then it just festers, right? Speaking of things that we definitely haven't solved, the last kind of legal group I want to talk about are laws related to sexual abuse and assault. So we did talk about this a little bit last week, but just as a recap, the term sexual abuse or sexual assault is any form of unwanted sexual behavior. It's often used interchangeably with the word rape. But importantly, what the definition of sexual assault is varies from culture to culture, from country to country, from state to state. For generations, it was not legally possible for a man to rape his wife because of laws that allowed spousal relationships to not be governed by other criminal laws. I'm not a legal scholar, but I know that there's this thing called the English common law, right, which is what governed England for many centuries. And sexual assault was not included in that because it just wasn't a thing. Of course, that's what people do to women, primarily at the time. Another illegal form of sexual behavior, of course, is trafficking, which is selling humans for the purposes of sexual exploitation. It's hard to measure because it's an underground thing and it's criminal and they don't fill out surveys and whatever. But based on known victims, the estimates are that about half of sex trafficking victims are adult women, and about a third of them are children. and the remainder are adult men. And so this is something that affects all types of people, but primarily women. And then there's also a different term called sexual slavery, which is, it can result from sex trafficking. A person can be trafficked into sex slavery. The trafficking is the selling of the person. The sexual slavery is the assertion of the right of ownership over another person with the intent of coercing them to engage in sexual activities. All three of these types of behaviors, of course, are legislated, are criminalized in the U.S. Most of them are internationally criminalized, but again, how we define words like sexual assault or what is sexual or sex trafficking, right, varies, and that's where differences in laws and loopholes and things like that can occur. Questions about any of these? Yep.
Is sexual slavery, and how do I say this right, an extra charge, a separate charge?
Than trafficking?
No, like we hear the stories of the women that were kidnapped and locked in a basement.
Right.
Is now kidnapping, sexual assault, and sexual slavery?
As far as I know, it might be state by state whether it's an official different charge, but yes, it is its own thing.
Okay.
Because not only were they kidnapped and abused, they were also, right of ownership was exerted over them, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah. Yep, good question.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, of course.
What is interesting that most of South America, Central America, South America is legalized prostitution, but you cannot call it prostitution because it insinuates that some minors are doing it, and that's not good.
Right.
Another thing is considered an occupation. So if it's considered an occupation, you have health insurance,
Taxes.
you have support, taxes, and everything else. But the problem with the legalization in many of like United States, okay, Western countries, the problem is how are you going to pay taxes?
Right.
Unless it's going to be just a credit card.
Right.
It's a really, really catch-22. And I don't think that legalization is going to make it a ton of money for taxes.
Yeah.
Because a lot of ways to hide taxes. Now, my opinion, if I was going to do that, I want to have a limo pick me up, go to the best hotel, come back, get my money, put it in the bank.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, done. Selected clients. What was the name of that girl in Hollywood?
Heidi Fleiss.
Yes, she knew how to do it. Unfortunately,
The Hollywood Madam.
Yes. If that's good, I'm not going to get benefits. I'm going to create my own benefits. Period.
Yeah.
Because that's a reality. Is it an occupation? Or it's just an exploitation?
Right. Well, that's an interesting point, though. If it is defined as an occupation, at least say in South America or something, and then by defining something as an occupation, that automatically assumes there are certain protections and rules and regulations, right? And so there are benefits to. Not to these, but to sex work, to approving it and regulating it for sure.
By the way, for the rest of the class, I'm too old, okay? I'm 80.
Yeah, but you're a feisty 80.
No, thanks.
Too vain.
I'm good.
Why don't we take a break here then? This is a perfect time to take a break. Everybody can go look up the laws in your area, but we'll come back in about 10 minutes or so and talk about some of the other responses to sexual behavior, and we'll talk about our activity for today, okay? All right, see you all in about 10 minutes.
I'm actually feeling very, actually
everyone. Welcome back. So in the second half today, we're going to continue talking about a few more laws and regulations in place that relate to sexual orientation or sexual behavior. Excuse me. And then we'll end up by talking about like how do we get attitudes to change, right? How have they changed, and how maybe can we encourage change? So let's switch back to the computer, please. Thank you. So I left off talking about different kinds of laws. We talked about laws related to sex work and laws related to prostitution. That is sex work, but anyway. Another kind of set of laws is specifically laws about sexual orientation. And here's what's interesting. Some societies enforce norms that are aimed at controlling the public images of same-gender sexual orientation. So primarily homosexuality, although I suppose any non-normative sexual relationship would fall under this, but so, for example, in Russia, there is a very strong program against what they call gay propaganda, right? Which is laws that criminalize any depiction of non-traditional sexual relationships. The way they claim it's to protect minors, right? That it's as long as if kids can see it. Then, so if it's anywhere in public, for example, a kid could see it, and then you would get in trouble, right? And I don't mean, just kissing another person of the same gender out on the street, but even mentioning the word, right, or having a T-shirt that says, pro-homosexuality or whatever. That's the law isn't specifically banning the behavior, but it bans talking about or showing or discussing that kind, that behavior. If that sounds really wild and oppressive and something, of course, Russia would do, well, we have states in the United States that actually do the same thing. As you mentioned before, Texas notoriously being one of them, right? Where some, go ahead.
A specific state law, because I know in Austin it's not a big deal. So, like, is it because they want to enforce it in Austin, or is it a municipality-based law? I can see that being both. I don't know that.
I don't know specifically the one for you that you were talking about before. The one here, it is a statewide law, but it might just not be enforced. That you cannot discuss same-gender sexuality, or some states it's not that you can't discuss it, but if you discuss it, you have to. It requires you to give a negative portrayal of same-gender sexuality. Which is, to me, I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous. But it criminalizes, or at least, like, I don't think a teacher gets hauled off to jail, right? But they can get fined, they can get fired, they can, those kinds of things can still happen. And so, yes, it prohibits discussing homosexuality, or it says if you bring it up, you have to talk about it negatively. You can't talk about it neutrally or positively. So the states that have one or the other of these kinds of laws, as of this summer, I didn't check this week, but as of this summer, Alabama, Arizona, Iowa, Michigan, am I? Yeah.
Louisiana.
Oh, LA, sorry, Louisiana, my eyes are terrible, guys. Alaska, Arizona, I did it again. Alabama, Arizona, Louisiana, Michigan, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas.
A lot of those also tied to transgender laws as well.
Yes, and I was surprised not to see North Carolina on this because of their notorious bathroom bills and things like that, but they don't actually have these.
Yeah, there's no even compare to what Alabama.
Right, and there's not as much statewide agreement in North Carolina. It's much more regional. So yeah. So anyway, that there sometimes we try to control sexual orientation literally through the law, like behavior, like sodomy laws. Sometimes we try to attack it culturally through controlling how people talk about it, or where, or when. The last thing I want to mention with our social responses to sexualities is the military. And I know, Bern, I feel like this is just, all for you to give your experience on today. Sorry to put you on the spot, you don't have to. But anyway, we do know that the military has played a role in enforcing or reinforcing various sexual orientation norms. So until 2011, of course, LGBTQ people could not openly serve in the U.S. military under something called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was implemented in 1994, by Bill Clinton, right? So this was a nonpartisan thing at the time. A Democratic president had implemented Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was sort of meant to protect gay people.
It was a stopgap.
Yeah.
The idea was that as long as
If people couldn't ask you, you wouldn't have to admit
it
it.
was not all sexual. I mean, but it really wasn't just limited to like a lot of individuals units. In the end, had a policy of you're not supposed to have any behavior, whether it's same-sex or hetero.
Right.
So like when we came off the ship, we weren't supposed to kiss.
Right.
Period. It didn't matter if it was our wife or your husband or
Any display.
any display of
Yeah.
affection was not allowed except for children. You can hug, and, you know, just
Yeah.
you know that you're spouse.
And the idea was, well, that way, if we apply it equally, then it's not discriminatory, right? You know, that was the idea. Now, in practice, did it play out that way? No, of course not, right? And so by 2011, Barack Obama, who was president at that time, did repeal it. It was re-implemented in 2019 by then President Trump, who also included a ban on trans individuals serving in the military, which itself was also repealed by Joe Biden in 2021. So the military has been used as a sort of a platform to argue about this back and forth, right, for the last 30 years or so. I don't know what the exact answer to this is. I'm not a military expert, and so I don't know, but we can talk about the role of the military in should there be, you know, laws and regulations about sexual behavior. Well, probably of some kind, right? If you're dealing with, you know, people that have to serve overseas and have to protect secrets, and right, there's probably rules that need to be in place, but do they need to single out orientation as part of that? That's where the question maybe lies. Questions or comments about this one? I mean, short ones, but you know.
He was the military because the military, as a complex, is really contagious. But the second that they feel like they're being used as a tool for social change, that's when the bristle.
Yeah, and that's what you know. So like 2010, 2009, I can't remember which. My son was given orders to go to Guam. Now it was going to be a end of like a 2-year overhaul and all this stuff. Besides the point. But we had it lightened the blow of being told, hey, instead of going back to Norfolk, Virginia, you guys are going to go on to the next
Other side of the planet, yeah.
Years. We had a 3-star admiral come to tell us that. And he asked us as part of a question of all the stuff that were there, but he told us to the one part afterwards. He asked us 2 questions. He said, "Are you how comfortable are you with serving openly with LGBT people?" And everybody was just like, and it was pretty much on the spot, but everybody was like, "Yeah, whatever, who cares, right?" Then he asked, "How would you feel serving with women on board with us?" That was completely different.
So that wasn't as acceptable, yeah.
So it's kind of, you know, give and take, you know, it's kind of interesting. But that's just something else about, 2010, 2009. Women are now actively serving on separate as well. They're either betterment or detriment, depending on how some people view it. It doesn't help when the person who serves got in trouble for fraudulent paperwork, so that didn't help the whole image.
But it brings up that
But it's an interesting social question of it, as far as what the units view it, how they view it, and anyone didn't give a crap about that part of it. They knew we all knew who was gay.
yeah.
We all knew.
Yeah.
It's not like it was a big secret.
It doesn't come up when you're doing your job necessarily, so.
But the other thing is you go to courts where you know, prostitution's legal. And they were people that bought prostitutes all over there, and it wasn't like, oh yeah, you know, you'd see them going back to their hotel room with guys and the girl.
Right.
So going out to the hotel was kind of a joke here at the end. At least I was there at the beginning.
Yeah.
But it was a real joke at the end. Where it was like, everybody's like,
it was a joke at the beginning.
yeah, you were there at the beginning, I'm sure, and I was at the end. Or at the end, it was just, at that point, it was just how do we make this not discriminatory
Right.
in nature.
At the end, it was more of a concept of, oh, wait, nobody cares? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, but because nobody cares, we're just going to say, to be fair to the other people that you all know would be affected by this. Nobody's loving this by these behaviors, just to be fair.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, it was a response to the people. The fact that people were being
Bullied.
destroyed.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Like their careers, everything were being ripped away from them, sent to jail.
Yeah.
On or unfounded accusations,
Exactly.
right? Of a person's orientation. That's it.
It wasn't even something they talked about. If you had accusations, again, if you were being homosexual,
Yeah.
you were done.
Yeah. It definitely was meant to help. It just didn't necessarily help. But certainly not eventually.
Yeah, like I said, I wasn't there at the beginning, so
Yeah.
I don't know that side of it.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
You know, the problem with the military, remember, every time that you see a general, you see a major, they man. You know what I mean? You look at them, that's the image that they want to portray. So anything out of that norm is not acceptable. Could be accepted. Because the image was for you to be strong, you come back, you are a man. You know, and that's why that when they sign up for the military, from the war to war, they could not, they went to serve, they loved their country, but they could not disclose their sexuality.
Right.
And another thing was that because some of them, the minute that word got out was a lot of rape.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so to me, was protecting the image of the military.
I think so, but I think even like your first point too, that we have this unfair kind of the stereotype of what makes a good soldier, right? Very masculine oriented, right?
Yes.
And the stereotype of homosexual men is that they don't fit that stereotype, right? That they're not tough and strong and all those things, right? And so yeah, I could see that being part of the reason there was a stigmatization of homosexuals, right, as being quote unquote good or bad soldiers.
Yes.
And that could be where that kind of idea came from. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was that fear, you know, is this guy going to prince around, you know? You know what I mean? It was so much, the stigma was so big, and yet, guess what? Was enclosed. Nobody really, you know what I mean? Unless you're ostracized. And one thing or another, they do not come out and say, well, you know, he was discharged because we suspect that he was homosexual.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that doesn't have anything to do with your ability to serve.
Right.
Your sexuality doesn't have anything to do with your ability to serve, to do your job, to carry a gun, to be in combat.
Or at least it shouldn't. Yeah.
No, it shouldn't.
Right.
The same thing they did to women. Women could not go in combat because they were too feminine. You know, they couldn't handle the combat stuff.
Well, and that gets to another point, which is the role of gender in the military and the complicated roles, right, of both. Yes, there are stereotypes about women and how they might perform. There were stereotypes about men and how they might need to protect women, right? And then there were logical arguments on both sides as well. And yeah, it's complicated. Do you want to say something?
So it's not, for a lot of men that are serving, that were against women serving in combat roles, it's not necessarily because women can't control. It's because what is the risk of you serving in combat, let's say in Afghanistan or Iraq, where you get caught by one of these terrorist groups, that don't care, and they decide to make you a sexual slave for them.
Mhm.
That's a possibility. That was a concern. That was in their neck.
That the
Whether
risk-
that's true or not.
That the risk was higher for women in certain places.
The risk is higher for women in those situations if they get caught.
Uh-huh.
And so that was why a lot of men are against it. Whether that held true or not, that was why men were concerned. Some men, and other men that were, obviously there's concern about women being assaulted by their own soldiers as well. And that was concerned as well by some probably more upper level, I would say, rather than the lower level people. Just because that was a problem.
Sadly, anyone can be sexually assaulted by anyone, so yeah.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the understanding.
Yes, they can, unfortunately.
But yes,
So yeah, that was.
some of the argument. I'm sorry about that, yeah. But
Yes. So it's, when you have in the military with gender, especially in certain situations, like for instance combat, or in submarines in some cases, you're going to a small crew. I know for a fact one of the women that, she's a friend of mine that serves in the Coast Guard, she ended up on a ship where she was one of only 7 women on board the entire ship. So when you're looking at a small section, it can be very difficult for a woman in a role as they want to play for 6 months, and you've got 90 something men, half of which are single,
right.
that eventually those people are going to, you get antsy. They want to be going out to bars. They want to go do this stuff, and they can't. And they, bad things to them. I'm not apologizing for those men.
No,
But it puts an added stress on the whole crew. And so that's why a lot of times it's restricted to larger ships like aircraft carriers, which had it was like a whole city. So it's easier to have
diversity in general. Yeah.
On top of that, smaller crews, smaller units can't afford to lose a woman in case she gets pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a huge concern. That was the reason why most men were against women going on subs, at least as far as I was aware of, was that it was a big problem on aircraft carriers where there were women that would get pregnant right before deployment to get out of one deployment, and they would readily admit it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became an issue. And, for them, they could afford to lose. But you
One out of 1,000.
You can't lose.
Yeah.
When you have 100 people, you can't lose. And only in some divisions when you have 9 people, and you can't afford to lose that one person.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes it's an issue that people don't. It's easy to see from a large perspective, but when you start getting into the individual,
How it would play out in reality.
How things would play out, it's a lot more complex than just saying it's because of race or purely because of inequality reasons.
Right.
There's just some logistics that just suck, and it's the boring stuff.
It's the stuff, yeah. It's the regulatory stuff and the,
Trying
yeah.
to figure that stuff out real quick. But if a woman gets pregnant, even by accident, how devastating that can be to the unit as a whole. And someone just tried to say that sometimes there's talk of forcing birth control, and how does that affect the health of the woman and stuff like that.
Right, then there's a whole other can of worms.
It's an issue that goes much deeper than just this. It's not something you can sit here and discuss for days.
Right. And to Mimi's point, I think she is right too to say that some of it is founded on stereotypes and misunderstandings about the reality of men and women or sexual behavior. But your point is well taken. Yeah, definitely.
And yet, Israel been drafting women forever.
Yes, they have. Yep.
Yes. You know what I mean? And you don't seem, I don't know because I never lived in Israel, you don't seem to encounter those hurdles.
Yeah, and I don't believe they segregated units, but I could be wrong. Yeah, I didn't think so.
I don't think they do. But another thing is, remember that through the wars, women had desk jobs
Right.
in the military or behind the scenes.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's not uniforms, it's, you know what I mean? Polishing guns, what was very different. And was a great change because women had to face the workforce, took the women out of the house during the war because the husband was away, who was the breadwinner. And that gave the women an amount of liberty to get outside and work outside of the house.
Yes.
Even though it was factories, was different things. And then was that group of women who became pilots, but what's the black lady that was a big NASA contributor for the space flights You know, and they did.
May Whitman?
Her name
No,
was
not
on
May
maybe a
Whitman.
movie about them.
May Jemison, yeah.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Hidden
And I think
Figures.
She died last year. Yes.
Hidden Figures was the film.
Those black women became high-ranking, but guess what? They were black. We wouldn't know about them.
Right.
At the time, we could not know about them. You know, it's such a, also is a rich history of wars. I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
Because we see one of the things is how far we have come as women, how far we have come as military, you know, and all of this compares to everything else. And whoever made that point about women and the issues, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes.
Was a gentleman in the class.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it is changing, and it has changed, and there's opportunity for more change in the future. But I think you're right to point out, you know, historically there's been attempts to include women in various ways, in certain stereotyped roles, maybe like desk jobs, but that it is growth on the part of the culture, on the part of the military, on the part of the nation, whatever you want to call it, over time. That's true.
I mean, just look at the second. So, as of now, I've proposed a couple times this year, women are still not able to be drafted.
True, right? Women are not subject to the selective service, right?
So,
As of now, still.
One of the big discussion points was when that was proposed, this year at least, there was a larger group who said, let's just give her select service instead.
Yeah.
Instead of making it equal, it's now that women already talk about being introduced, now let's get rid of it.
Now let's get rid
Now let's not have it at all.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know, that seems kind of insulting in a way.
In a different way.
And I don't know if it's because of women serving, or is it because now is the time, oh, well, now we'll get rid of it because women are serving, instead of maybe.
I would like to hope that it's not that way, but I hear how it sounds, right? So I would like to think that many people think it shouldn't have existed in the first place, but that doesn't solve the problem, because it does, and so now it's changing in response to that. It feels like
It's almost an insult because women are now being introduced as perspective, because
we should protect them. It's a sort of patronizing, right? So, yeah.
It was more of a situation of it wasn't a problem until it started affecting them.
Ah.
And like you said, we can have arguments about how horrible or not horrible
A draft is.
the service was,
Yeah.
but there was never any talk about it until
Until it affected women, or potentially could affect women.
and that's the problem. So there's some men that are like, oh, because women are served, get rid of it. And that's true. There's some Republicans that said that. There's some Democrats that said, well, now it's affecting women, let's get rid of it. Let's now change the law, we
Yeah.
don't care about it until it became affecting our group. And then there's the ones that feed it, they're just like, I mean, I'm pretty sure AOC was the ones that, no, we need to support women in it.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
it. Like, she was like, equality. There you go.
That's what equality is, or
So
yeah.
that's what, I don't agree with everything
Anybody says, yeah.
And
But the logic
I was
there
like,
holds.
Wow, that's what needed to be said. Now, I don't think she exists at all. I
Right.
think she should be almost volunteer service all the time. But you never know if you have a real, true emergency. It's good to have
Where you need it, yeah.
the ready to go, already there, ready to go in case you need it, like somebody actually passed us.
Right.
God forbid.
In which case it should be all or none. But yes.
Like all word.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to move us on, not because this is not exciting and interesting, and there are great points, and everybody's, being totally reasonable, but we all don't want to stay here past time, right? So, okay. Last one, when it comes to the law that I want to talk about, and it'll transition us into our last topic and our activity for today, is the role of same-sex families, which is a weird phrase maybe, but it refers to families that are headed by a same-sex couple, or maybe a non-traditionally cisgendered heterosexual couple, if you want to call it that. Gay family, sometimes called, right? We've used the phrase gay marriage and same-sex marriage and marriage equality, all of this kind of stuff. What's important about this is the reason there's such arguing, or was, about what should the role of a marriage or marriage-like contract between two people look like, is because we recognize that our laws, by having laws for or against anything, laws give us the power to recognize or to deny recognition to various groups. And so what the problem is in the time period, let's say, of forever up through the 90s and early 2000s, right, is that there are same-gender families, there are couples who would like to engage in the act of marriage, and I mean that in a legal sense, not the religious sense, right? So, but for whom the laws did not recognize that kind of relationship, right? The marriage was legally male-female. And so there has been over decades, right, a push culminating in 2015 with a Supreme Court decision to recognize same-gender couples. In various places, there have been various solutions to doing this. So I'm talking about marriage in the legal sense, but before marriage was available to all same-sex couples, there were different kinds of recognition, like civil unions, which provided most of the same legal rights and benefits of traditional gender, like insurance and healthcare decision-making and all that, but did not give the legal recognition of the relationship as a marriage. It was a separate but equal kind of a thing, right, which we learned during segregation is not a thing. Things can't be separate and equal easily in human society. Domestic partnerships were even less protected, right? Actually, domestic partnerships are available to any couple of any gender makeup, right? You can be a heterosexual couple in a domestic partnership. It gives you a few of the rights and benefits of marriage, but mostly, not most of them. I don't know off the top of my head which exactly ones are covered and which aren't, but I know medical decision making is not always considered part of this, right? So when it comes to worldwide again, and I know you can't read that, that's fine. What we see is most of the world is blue or purple here, right? Blue are places where marriage is open to any couple, regardless of their gender, right? And purple are places where same-sex unions are not legally recognized in any form. And then other colors are other variations thereof. Some are domestic partnerships, some are, civil unions, some are, limited legal recognition, but not specifically a civil union or a domestic partnership. So, there's a lot of difference around the world, but primarily most countries fall into one of those two, either accepting it or not accepting it. But this is pretty wide. This is pretty, macro level, big scale, right? How do we enforce our rules and our norms, and how do we operate on the micro level, on the individual level? Right? So it turns out that society relies on its members to do a lot of policing, right? Members of society are expected to enforce social norms at the micro level too. So this is enforcing of our norms through personal interactions rather than through laws. Right? Laws are like a top-down approach. So policies, like don't ask, don't tell, or whatever, top-down. There is something to be said for a lot of our norms in society are actually enforced from bottom up. And that's where we get things like stigma and stereotypes and all sorts of things. One example of that is as non-heterosexual groups were gaining recognition in society, primarily just recognition, but also some rights and protections, they experienced a backlash, right? Things like bullying, harassment, and violence based on sexual orientation still persists today. We have not, solved this problem, if you will. Of course, that hate crimes are still in existence. Of course, those can be about race or gender or any characteristic of a person, but specifically LGBTQ characteristics as well. And less than half of all states in the United States have laws to protect LGBTQ folks from discrimination in housing, employment, public service, and so on. Though we have laws that protect against discrimination on the basis of religion and race and gender, nationally and in every state, not every state, and in fact less than half of the states include sexual orientation as one of the protected categories. Maine does, but again, less than half overall do. So yeah, you can get in trouble for not hiring somebody because they're black, but you don't get in trouble for not hiring somebody because they're gay. And that can be a problem. Questions about this information? Oh, I'm going to keep going on this though. So I mentioned hate crimes, right? And more than half of LGBTQ middle school students, so these are pre-teens, early teens, right? 10 to 13 or somewhere in there. Middle school students report experiencing verbal harassment at school. More than half. And more than 20% of those middle schoolers face physical harassment, which includes things like pushing and shoving. And 10% have suffered actual physical violence, which is more than just physical harassment and includes punching, kicking, or injury with a weapon. Some schools have implemented policies to make schools safer for all students, but in particular for LGBT students. Some have had success and some haven't. I don't unfortunately have a nice bullet point that wraps this up in a we solved it kind of way. But this is an ongoing social issue that is what it is a symptom of our society trying to enforce this norm of heterosexuality and relying on individuals to do that.
And I will say, I have a 12-year-old, and I'm blown away at the students she goes to school with and, like, how open and accepting they are of, like, each other in general. We're doing this Zoom thing right now half the time, and so
right.
I see their interactions and stuff, and I'm blown away. It's vastly different from when I was 12.
I have a daughter who's 13 and one is 17. They're both in public school too, and it's just, it is remarkable the difference. And just
even just exposure, like even just talking about things and like seeing different kinds of people is I can see that.
So I'm actually going to stop it right here because I think we got the information we really need. But I appreciate you watching with me, and I hope you enjoy the next video.